What are the biggest risks that British expats and others take when it comes to their finances? So in this video, I'm going to talk about the risks that British expats and others take when it comes to their finances. And before doing that, go over to adamfired.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net wealth individual, and see how I can help you, and indeed are currently helping people like yourself presently. Now, British expats and other people living overseas, what are the biggest kind of risks I'm seeing in the market? Now, most people might assume that just not saving and investing enough is the biggest risk that people take. Indeed, that is true in some ways, but it's kind of an obvious thing. So I was reading something online which said that most British expats who live in places like Dubai and the UAE and some Arab markets come home with less money than they came, ironically, despite zero taxes, just because of the lifestyle and all the things that go with that in some of the expat markets. So that's obviously one aspect. That's true. Not saving and investing enough is one of the risks that people take, because obviously usually you're outside of the social security system when you become an expat. But a much bigger risk, assuming you're actually saving and investing, is actually inheritance tax and estate planning. A lot of people forget this, that the chance that you will have to pay 40% or between 36 and 40% of what you pass down to your children is quite high if you don't take action. Now, let me explain that. A lot of people think, oh, I'm not a British tax resident, I'm not a resident, so therefore it's quite easy not to pay UK inheritance tax. However, domicile is very different to tax residency. Now, let me explain that. In the UK, whilst you're living, it's really quite easy not to pay tax to the UK government, or most taxes, in terms of there's a UK's ties test you can find online from HMRC. And on that ties test, basically, to cut a long story short, the more days you spend in the UK and the more ties you have to the UK, and the ties can be defined, you can find them online, means the more risk you're taking. So for example, if you spend less than 9 days a year in the UK, I think basically you're not a British tax resident in almost all circumstances. But then if you spend between 9 and 18 days, I think it's 5 or 6 ties. But once you get to like 70 or 80 days, it might only be 3 or 4 ties. So it's a misconception that there's like a so-called 90-day rule and a 180-day rule and that kind of thing. Some people think they can spend 5 months a year in the UK and 7 months elsewhere and automatically not pay tax. That's not true. But what is true is it's fairly easy to stay on the right side of the law when it comes to UK tax residency. There are some things you should probably not do. You shouldn't keep too many ties to the UK, but it's not as strict as domicile. Now with domicile is something that kind of sticks to you more than your citizenship or tax residency and that kind of thing. Even your citizenship, you can give up your British or German citizenship, even American citizenship. You can buy citizenship overseas. But when it comes to domicile, it's the hardest thing to change. So basically, obviously this is not formal legal advice, but when you look at the opinions about how to get rid of domicile, or your British domicile if you lived or were born in the UK and lived most of your life in the UK, it's very complicated. So even if you only spent the first 25, 30 years in the UK, but both your parents are British, and then you spend 70 years overseas, you can still easily pay 40% tax above the inheritance tax threshold. So if you've got a few million from property and other assets, you can still be liable for UK inheritance tax. And getting rid of that domicile is very difficult. It's only likely if you do things like give up your citizenship and take many steps to make sure you've got rid of all your British ties. With that being said, obviously you've got to ask a follow-up question. That's how can you actually deal with this situation? If you've got, say, 10 million when you die, and the people inheriting the money pay 40% on 9 point something million, that's a lot of money that they're going to have to pay. So there's another way of doing this, of course, and that's not trying to change your domicile, but doing things like giving away some of the money and putting it in offshore trusts. So then you're actually not owning the money yourself, That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is you can also put life insurance in trust. So therefore, even if there is a big inheritance tax, bill, your family can pay, because this is something a lot of people forget as well. A lot of people, they think, well, if I've got millions and millions, even if my children or whatever have to pay inheritance tax, they can just sell off some of the assets. It might be annoying, but they can just sell off the assets and pay the bill. But ultimately, unless all your money is in ETFs and funds and stocks and shares, things that can easily be sold off, realistically, what's going to happen is it's going to take months to sell those assets and, for everything to go through probate. I mean, I was at a convention 1 or 2 weeks ago, and one of the speakers mentioned that he was helping one of his high net worth clients. And basically, only one of the investment companies paid out the money. Now, they paid it out very quickly. They paid it out within 3 or 4 days. But the other onshore investments, they actually haven't paid out. It's all going through probate. And in actual fact, apart from the offshore companies that are used to this situation, sometimes it can actually take a long time to get assets to loved ones. And that means there's often a liquidity issue, because if you have to come up with a lot of money quickly, if you've inherited money from someone who lives overseas and you weren't expecting there to be any inheritance tax on that, obviously that can cause a liquidity event, and something like life insurance can also deal with that. So basically, it's very complicated. It does depend on the individual and their circumstances. But my suggestion would be, don't let this particular issue drag on. If you've got assets which are above the threshold, put in a plan in place, which could involve trusts or insurance or changing your domicile or whatever is appropriate. Deal with advisors and investment companies that are in the offshore space, where the payments to loved ones is going to be relatively quick, and take the appropriate steps, because if you go online, you can see there's so many examples of people who have been stung by this over the years.
Depends on every person's individual goals, how much money they want to invest, how long they want to invest. And I did not have at all the feeling from any bank with which I had contact with that they were interested in these things. Whereas with you, it was from the very beginning obvious to me that you had experience in these matters and also were interested in what I wanted to achieve.
Anyways, I'm very, very pleased and positive to say that I believe I've picked the right one. The results in the last couple of years have overreached my expectations by far. And I see no reason why it should not continue. Of course, I can highly recommend him as your financial advisor for now and for the future, because hesitating is missing out.
So I'm investing a lot in the Middle East market, but the amount of returns I'm getting from there is very low as per the amount of returns I'm getting from the investment portfolio which you made for me. Obviously, the best result in market right now is Adam.